This is fascinating. One of the most renowned cellists of our generation is going to make his India debut. I'm very pleased to welcome Steven Isserlis. As a concerto soloist, he appears regularly with the world's leading orchestras and conductors, including the Berlin Philharmonic, National Symphony Orchestra, Washington, London Philharmonic, and the Zurich orchestras. As a chamber musician, he has curated series for many of the world's most famous festivals and venues, including the Wigmore Hall, the 92nd Street Y in New York, and the Salzburg Festival. Steven enjoys a unique and distinguished career as a soloist, a chamber musician, an educator, an author, and broadcaster. And just to cue you guys in, the Symphony Orchestra of India's autumn season has Schumann and Stravinsky on the 20th of September. Tickets are at Book My Show as we speak, also at ncpamumbai.com. And it features Alpesh Chauhan as a conductor and Steven on the cello. Thank you for your time, and we can't wait for your India debut. How do you feel?
Well, it's going to be a brief visit. I'm there for 2 days. I'm mad. But we just had to fit it in between other things. It was either that or don't come at all. So I said, okay, I'll go for 2 days.
I believe,
I don't regret
Steven,
it. You don't regret it.
Of course we won't. It'd be such a pleasure to see you perform. I believe you were writer and presenter of a documentary about the life of Robert Schumann on BBC Radio. So Schumann's work must be very close to your heart, Steven, and I'd like you to talk about that and also the cello concerto that you'll be performing on the 20th.
Yes, Schumann has always been a major figure in my musical life, even somehow in my personal life. I love to read about Schumann. I featured him in my first book for children, which was, well, the title was Why Beethoven Threw the Stew, but one of the chapters was about Schumann. And then I also co-wrote a book with him because he wrote a book of advice for young musicians, and I sort of updated it, adapted it. And so I'm proud to call him my co-author. And I've just always loved his music ever since I was a little boy. And the Cello Concerto is one of his greatest works. It's a masterpiece. For me, if I had to choose one cello concerto, it would have to be Schumann, I think. It's the most personal of all concertos, and it's lyrical, it's beautiful, it's joyous, but it's profound. It's got everything. It's a great, great work.
Steven, I'd like you to talk about Alpesh Chauhan, young conductor of Indian descent, full of beans. You must be looking forward to working with him. I
am, but I've never met him. Actually, I did go to a concert of his, which I enjoyed, and I went backstage to try and find him, and he'd gone. I think I couldn't find him. So, but I hear very good things about him, and I also hear he's a marvelous chef, which interests me greatly.
A foodie, eh? Wonderful. I'd like your thoughts on the Symphony Orchestra of India. I mean, even though this is your first trip to India, you're no stranger with your amazing body of work to what goes into the making of a successful orchestra and what Marat Bisangaliev and Khushru Santuk at the NCPA have managed to achieve with the SOI. Now, Steven, there are trainees who are transforming into permanent members. There's another tour of the UK and Europe which has just been announced. And of course, so many scholarships and support programs for people of all ages to join the Symphony Orchestra of India. And of course, the constant influx of renowned conductors and cellists such as yourself. How does all of this augur for the well-being and the development of an orchestra is my question to you.
Well, it sounds like a great idea. It's bringing all these young people, and I hope from all sorts of different religions and you know, whatever parts of society. That's great. And if it can become an integral part of India's life, that'd be great. I mean, you know, there is also Indian classical music, which is something different, which is a very, very great tradition as well, but the two can certainly coexist. I'm glad it sounds very enlightened. Of course, I won't really know until the first rehearsal how they sound and how the atmosphere is, but it sounds very promising. And to have all these young people sounds great, because that always makes a big difference. And I did actually see Ed Smith, who used to be the manager. He lived in India for a bit, and he said very encouraging things about it.
Steven, shall we see an appearance made by the venerable instrument? Let me explain to all of our listeners, viewers. Steven gives most of his concerts on the Marquis di Corberon, Nelsova Stradivarius. Year 1726. Wow. Kindly loaned to him by the Royal Academy of Music. Please tell us about the instrument and your association with it, and shall we see it on stage here at the NCPA?
You should see it on stage, all being well. Yeah, it's a great instrument. It's an aristocrat, as the name implies, although the actual aristocrat after whom it was named was guillotined. So I hope that doesn't happen to the cello ever. But it's a beautiful instrument. It was bought for the cellist Zara Nelsola many, many years ago on the condition that it would go to the Royal Academy of Music after she died. And I knew Zara. And in fact, she came to the chamber music seminar, which I sort of run down in Prussia Cove, Cornwall, where I'll be next week. And she played, and my best friend, I was sitting with him, and after she played, he turned to me and said, "That's the cello for you." I had no idea then that I would end up playing it, but it's a beaut. It's a very, very special cello.
Can't wait to see it, and most importantly, hear it. Stephen, I find it remarkable that you're prolific enough to do all that you do, and your website now says that there's a book on Bach concertos suites, that you've written. There's this wonderful thing about writing for children. I know you do find enough time to teach and do master classes too. How important is that for you? Given that you play for various philharmonic orchestras around the world, just to give back, Stephen.
Yeah, it's very important. And I love also to play chamber music with young musicians. And I've given in my time many concerts for children. That's all important. It gives you sort of life and vitality. I think hopefully they get something out of it. I get something out of it. And I've done a lot of teaching recently. Next year, I really don't have the time to do as much. But after lockdown, when finally it opened up, I was giving a lot of classes. And often, if I'm playing in San Francisco, I will teach at the conservatory there. That happened, for instance, San Francisco, many cities. And that's very nice because I get to meet the young musicians. And then, years later, I might come across a young musician who says, "I played for you." My first question is always, "Was I nice to you?" And these days, it's usually yes. It didn't used to be. But no, I enjoy having that interaction, and I enjoy their enthusiasm. And I do feel a certain duty as well to pass on what I was taught by my great teachers to younger people today, and try and sort of at least give them a sense of the values I was given, which are certainly not what are always given in music these days.
That's wonderful. Now, I know this is predominantly about your performance here at the NCPA, but I cannot help but ask about your forthcoming recordings, including a special First World War inspired disc with Connie Shee, including works performed on a travel cello, now known as the trench cello, played in the trenches by a World War I soldier called Harold Triggs. Stephen, I find it fascinating that a soldier would play a cello in the trenches while the horrors of war unfolded.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that disc was made a few years ago, sometime during the centenary of the First World War. Yeah, it's amazing. And, I think the trench life was much more varied than one thinks. I've just started reading a novel, actually, about the First World War. And, he would play for the officers and the officers' mess, and possibly play for dances. I don't know, but he certainly played. And this little trench cello, I'd heard about it from Charles Beer, who's the sort of doyen of musical instrument experts the world over. Just having lunch with him, and he just mentioned this. I said, "I've got to see this." So I went down to Kent, where he lived, and he put it together for me. It took him about 5 minutes or something. It would have taken me 3 hours. Put the strings took the strings out of the box. It's an empty box, basically. In the shape of the cello, but without any curves. So actually not in the shape of a cello. Anyway, took everything out, the bridge, the strings, put it out, and this lovely small sound emerged. And then I ended up, mostly the disc is on the Strad, but I think we recorded 4 pieces at the end on the trench cello. And it was a lovely thing to do. And this cello seemed proud. And I played it in Westminster Abbey, some centenary of one of the First World War events.
Wow.
Musicians sitting there. And yeah, it's a lovely thing. I haven't played it for a few years now, but I always had a special affection for this little French cello.
My last question is coming back to Schumann. A simple Google will tell you about a man who lived a troubled life. But obviously the genius of his is so apparent from the music. What to you is the most extraordinary thing about Schumann? I think that would be a nice way to wind down this chat.
Well, Schumann tells you everything about his life. Basically, he just invites you in. In a way, I think if you'd met him, there would have been no such contact. He was very, very painfully shy and silent, self-absorbed. But in his music, and Cello Concerto is no exception. Cello Concerto was actually written at a happy time of his life, when he just moved to Dusseldorf and he was music director, his first big job, and he was happy. And there is a troubled section where you really feel the agony of his soul at some point, but it's all swept away, and it's essentially a joyous piece. I mean, it's essentially a love song, I think. The first melody is just like this gorgeous, sort of the sun rises in the first 4 bars, and then you have this gorgeous love melody, which is unlike anything else in any other concerto. And then you have, as I say, the troubled central section of the first movement, and then you have this perfect sort of paradise of a slow movement, and then this very joyous extrovert last movement. So yeah, what is so extraordinary about Schumann is that he was a complete genius. I mean, brilliant sort of intellectually as well. I mean, the connections between motives and things is extraordinary. The more you look at it, the more in awe you are, but also just this amazing soul, such warmth and such poetry. Genius.
Lovely. Can't wait to welcome you with open arms into India. Steven Isserlis, the world-renowned cellist, shall play on the 20th of September, 7 p.m. at the Jamshid Baba Theatre, part of the Symphony Orchestra of India's autumn season. It's Schumann and Stravinsky. Book now at Book My Show, as well as at ncpamumbai.com. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Steven, and
Thank you.
hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to This Week at the NCPA, and a special guest as part of the autumn season, a season that we're all very, very excited about. A man with impeccable credentials. Let me read out just a couple of them. Richard Farnes, the English conductor, was music director of Opera North for 12 years, from 2004 to 2016. He specializes in opera and guest conducts symphonic orchestras across the UK, including the London Symphony Orchestra, the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, BBC Philharmonic and Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. Wonderful to see you, and welcome back to India. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's great to be back here.
Now, Richard conducts the Symphony Orchestra of India on the 15th. A really, really wonderful concert, and I urge all of you to go to bookmyshow.com right away, or you could go to ncpamumbai.com and block your seats. This is at the Jamshid Baba Theatre. It's 7 p.m. on the 15th. It's part of the SOI autumn season, Brahms and Wagner, and we shall chat a little bit about that with Richard. I find it lovely that you would start with John Williams' Imperial March from Star Wars. I think John's contribution to Western classical is right up there with the greats. Richard, I'd like you to comment on that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think John Williams is an absolutely superb composer. I mean, composing for the movie genre is very different from writing sort of absolute music that doesn't necessarily go along with a particular movie scene or anything. So it's a very particular technique. But one of the things I love about John Williams's music is that so much of it is self-contained. So you can actually perform a lot of his film scores as concert pieces. And this one is one of the best, one of the most famous. And I just felt that it was it was my suggestion. And to be honest, I wasn't sure whether the orchestra would take the bait, whether they would want to do it in the context of this program. But he's a composer that always admired. I admire his orchestration, his sheer inventiveness. And this is one of those iconic pieces that even if you haven't seen the movie, you've heard this march. And it's a fantastically, almost traditional way of writing an orchestral march.
Every single person at the Jamshid Baba would know the march. So, that's an inherent advantage the moment you start off. Well, this isn't the first time you're in Mumbai, Richard, to conduct the Symphony Orchestra of India. What do you think of the National Centre of the Performing Arts, the Grand Jamshid Baba, where you shall be performing on the 15th, and the Tata Theatre, the complex itself, and of course the orchestra?
It's fantastic to come here. The facilities are absolutely wonderful. And actually, although that, of course, is very important, actually, always the most important thing is that the people you're working with. I cannot commend the whole orchestra setup enough. I mean, you are made to feel so welcome as a visitor here. And I was very, very happy to be asked back again, having been here for the first time, and the first time in India, actually, last year. The NCPA is a wonderful institution in a very beautiful part of the city. And I made a point of, when I was here last time, of getting to see as much of the city in the space of time that I could, because it's known for its sheer vibrancy, the incredible range of things that people are doing, manufacturing, the arts, of course, here. The different scale of everything is unbelievable. And of course, I'd never really seen so many people in my life in such a place. It was amazing. But the NCPA is a wonderful part of town to be working and effectively living in for a while. And I'm also very pleased that we're rehearsing with the orchestra in the venue, in the theatre where we are performing. Now, this is something that doesn't often happen in the UK. Often the halls themselves have got such a tight schedule with lots of different outfits and ensembles coming in to perform on consecutive nights, that you often rehearse an orchestra for some days beforehand in another venue, in another part of town, with a very different acoustic, with very different facilities. Sometimes it's quite difficult to get to. And then suddenly you're there for the very final rehearsal on the afternoon or the morning of the concert, and you suddenly have to adjust everything to the acoustics. It's wonderful to be able to rehearse the orchestra in the actual venue in which we're performing. So right from the beginning of the rehearsals, we are adjusting things to suit the acoustics, and that's a fantastic advantage of being here.
Thank you. Thank you for being so lucid and explaining that to us, because as a audience member, as an aficionado, as a lover of Western classical music, one always looks for behind the scenes insights. And that's a wonderful insight that you've given us, and makes us very proud that you're rehearsing at the same place you're going to be performing at. Were you aware, Richard, that Maestro Zubin Mehta just conducted the Symphony Orchestra of India last month for the very first time? And those are tall shoes to fill. Here's the autumn opening with you as the conductor. Your comments, please, Richard.
Yes, I was very aware that Zubin Mehta was coming. I saw all the publicity and I thought, my goodness, I'm following on from him. I mean, he is somebody that, well, all of us, all conductors admire. His sheer energy, his experience, his absolutely unbelievable talent. So, I mean, in a way, he is one of a number of conductors who've been quite an inspiration to me over the years. And I mean, I've been working in this business for decades now, but his experience is unbelievable. And it's fantastic that he was here to conduct the orchestra. I'm very pleased about that.
Now, for those of you living under a rock, Richard Farnes has a close affinity with Wagner, touring concert performances of the operas across the UK. His project to perform the entire Ring cycle 6 times in 2016 won public and critical acclaim. Now, let me explain that. It's a cycle of 4 German-language epic music dramas composed by Richard Wagner. The works are based loosely on characters from Germanic heroic legend, namely Norse legendary sagas. Talk to me about your love and fascination for Wagner, and in that light, what can we expect on the 15th when the Symphony Orchestra of India performs Wagner's Parsifal Suite?
Wagner is a composer who he's such a huge influence in the history of classical music. In fact, he's a generally enormous artistic influence over the whole of European culture from the 19th century. And I've often heard that more has been written about him than almost anybody, apart from possibly religious figures like Jesus Christ. He partly because not only was he an amazing talent, he obviously wrote not just the music, but he also produced the text, the libretto for all his works, or most of the significant ones. But he also had a notorious private life and was always short of money. And if he was alive today, I've always imagined that he would possibly be an incredibly influential movie director.
Wow.
So he would be there, a sort of James Cameron figure, but somebody who also writes all his scores. He does all his own screenplay. He writes all the music for the movie. He's the epitome of the sort of do it everything, have control over absolutely everything type person. And I feel that he would also exert quite a tight control over every operation of the movie that he was working on. And he's because of his huge influence, I mean, whatever you think about his private life, which would be all over the what we call in Britain the gutter press, the sort of newspapers that love lurid stories, they would be full of details about him as often as they could get their hands on them. But whatever you say about that, you cannot deny that his work, his music is incredibly powerful. It's the sort of music, it's a bit like Mozart, really. You cannot imagine a time when it didn't exist. It has a sort of seminal, visceral feeling behind it. It comes, you just don't know really, it seems to come from the earth. And it's very difficult to imagine that somebody was born and created all of this extraordinary music. Now, I never had, when I was younger, I mean, I was very aware of his music, like all people who study classical music become at some point. But, you know, he's not known for writing symphonies. He's not known for writing piano concertos. So when you're a youngster, you don't usually get the chance to conduct his music because, as you've just described, he's most famous for big music dramas. These are very expensive pieces to put on. They have huge orchestras. They require enormous resources for a theatre and an orchestral management to absorb. And therefore, you don't usually get the opportunity to conduct this material. So when we were doing it at Opera North, he was not necessarily a composer that I was particularly associated with. But when you start working on his music, it's so all-enveloping. It just takes everything else sort of seems to disappear into insignificance. And because the music is so powerful, there were people, when we did it at Opera North, there were people in the orchestra who had been in that orchestra for 30 years, ever since the company was founded. And they joined the company hoping to play the Ring Cycle, this famous 4-part piece, epic, 15, 16 hours of music. And they'd never done it before. And so when I was asked to conduct it, because I was the music director at the time, and we decided that this was the right time to do this project, suddenly the whole company came together and there was huge enthusiasm for it. And despite the number of rehearsals that you need and the length of the pieces, the stamina that's needed for the singers and the orchestra, everybody is always up to the task because you just get completely swept up in it. So the suite that we're playing at the concert on the 15th is a suite that was made really quite recently, just a couple of years ago, I think, by a British conductor, Andrew Gourlay, who has a huge love of this work, Parsifal. Now, Parsifal is Wagner's final music drama. And a lot of Wagner's best music in his operatic work is actually in the orchestral writing. You get these big interludes between the scenes. Sometimes you get music within the scenes that is very much orchestrally based rather than vocally based. And it's invigorating material to play for an orchestra. And so Andrew Gourlay made this suite out of a sheer love of this. I don't think anybody particularly done a sort of an excerpt, or that nobody'd actually created a type of piece, a concert piece out of Parsifal before. So this was a big labor of love, I think he called it himself. And it's a chance for an audience to hear some of the best and most famous parts of Parsifal, which is a piece known for the sheer beauty of the music in the music drama. So it's a good opportunity to hear much of this in a concert format instead of going to the theatre. And I mean, the whole piece is a good 4.5 hours long in the music. So with intervals, it's a big evening.
Wonderfully described. My final question is, further great news for Western classical music fans. Pavel Kolesnikov, the celebrated pianist, also returns to join the Symphony Orchestra of India in Brahms' second piano concerto. Let's talk about that upcoming performance, Richard.
Brahms is a composer. It's very interesting in the program because he's almost regarded as the antithesis of Wagner. So in the 19th century, when both of them were alive, there was a sort of school of Wagner followers versus a school of Brahms followers. And the ones who supported, if you like, Brahms were people who, they didn't like the extravagance of Wagner. They loved the fact that Brahms wasn't writing big sort of stage works. He was writing what they call absolute music. In other words, this is music that is dramatic, but it doesn't require a staging or any particular story to go alongside it. Now, for musicians, Brahms is an absolute favorite because I think musicians always admire the way it's constructed. There's a lot of influence from Beethoven. Brahms regarded Beethoven as a real god. I mean, he shied away from writing a symphony for a long time, till he was in his 40s, I think, because he felt the shadow of Beethoven standing over him. But he wrote some fantastic concerti, 2 piano concertos, violin concerto, double concerto for violin and cello. And this second piano concerto is one of my favorite piano concertos of all time, not just my favorite Brahms pieces, but I think it's the most wonderful concerto. It's a big piece. It's a big 4-movement piece. 4 movements is quite unusual for a concerto. Normally they're made up of 3. You have a sort of a faster movement, an energetic first movement, usually very serious. Then you might have a slow, more melancholy possibly, or beautiful middle movement, and then you usually have a very lively, energetic finale. Now here we've got a 4-movement piece, which immediately makes it a little bit more like a symphony. And almost my favorite thing about this piece, apart from the fact that Pavel is playing it, because he's the most wonderful pianist, is the 4th movement, the final movement, because this is a big 45 minute piece. And yet the last movement, just where you expect it to be this big, giant, sort of serious, maybe calamitous or huge piece with big columns and big architectural structure, you just get this wonderfully light-hearted, sunny, fun, bright and breezy movement that finishes this very big concerto. And to me, that's an amazing accomplishment of Brahms to produce that at the end of this piece.
I can't wait for that to play out at the Jamshed Baba Theatre. 15th of September, 7 p.m. onwards. Tickets are at Book My Show and as well as at the ncpamumbai.com site. It's the Symphony Orchestra of India Autumn 2023, Brahms and Wagner. And like Richard Farnes, the conductor, just said, is John Williams thrown in in equal measure. I really appreciate your time. It's a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Richard, and hope to see you back in India very, very soon.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.
94.3 Radio 1.